Performance Monitor is one of those tools that has been around for over a decade. Whenever a new application is installed onto a server, such as you take server 2012 R2 like we're running here, and you apply SQL to it, and then new counters are installed into Performance Monitor because we assume today that you have dedicated servers for each of your major applications, which may not be the case. It certainly wasn't the case years ago, but today it's pretty much true. You know, in Performance Monitor, that's really what you want to take a look at. Also want to look at some of the built-in system things, counters such as your CPU usage, etc., to see how that's doing. You know, the big three, CPU, disk, and net, your network traffic, to see what's happening. So that's something else you want to consider. The thing about Performance Monitor is it's one of those tools that's a reactive tool. We tend to fire up Performance Monitor and let it run to see if we can find out what's happening because things have slowed down or we're running into problems. We are rapidly moving into the world of being proactive, and we're more proactive in SQL with dynamic management views, which we're going to take a look at a little bit later on. So right now, let's just fire up perfmon. So I'm going to hit my Windows key, PERFM, and there's Performance Monitor. And I'll run it as administrator, though I didn't really need to. So here's perfmon, and she's up and she's running. So if I look at the tool, which really is quite extensive, here's the real time, and I can add counters right here. And as you see, there's processor information. So if I expanded it on down, time, etc., idle time, interrupt time, and I'll just add a counter in here. You see all the counters that we have. Here's user time. I'll add that one in also. And you notice down here, I am running on a virtual machine, and I have 4 cores to my processor. Close this up and move down, and I can look at SQL. So look at all the counters that are added in here for SQL. There's just lots of stuff. The SQL broker service, the buffer manager, that's always an interesting one. Buffer cache hit ratio. And if you look at books online in perfmon as far as SQL, you'll see they have recommended ones to utilize. Also, some people have done some templates so you can bring it down. I'll show you that in just a second. So we're okay here, and I'm going to say okay, and you see they've been added now. So I can get down here and take processor, like interrupt time, and I can right click on it. And then I could show or hide, remove all counters, etc. If I take that here, I can bing this and that will highlight it. So you can see this scale. We don't have any activity, so there's nothing really there. But otherwise, we'd have the activity across our histogram. Now, another thing we can do, if I go into data collection sets, and I can go in here to system, here's the system diagnostics and system performance. These are pre-canned, and I can go ahead and start them and pick up, and it's the entire server that I'm on. So let's look at user defined. Then I'm going to right click. I'll go new data collector set and give it a name, my set 1. That's fine. And we're going to create it from a template. Notice it's recommended. So we'll go next. And then which one do I want to do? And then browse. This is where I said you can download these templates, and some people have spent some time on them. It's something you might want to take a look at. So we'll go system performance. And down here, where do I want to save it? I'm going to save this into a spot that's easier for us to see. So code, and we're now in chapter 8. Say OK, and we'll call finish. And there's my set 1, and I'm going to right click it and call start. And we'll just let that run. While that's running, let's do another one. I'm going to right click and I'll go new data collector set, and I'll call this my SQL. This one I'm going to create manually. That's advanced. And we'll say next. And what I want to create, and I'm going to bring in performance counters. And we'll call next. And it's going to collect every 15 seconds. We're going to change that to 1 because we just don't have any activity. And we're going to call add. And let's drill down and find some stuff in SQL. Buffer manager. And we're going to add everything. And you see if I just select everything, which automatically selects all counters from Buffer Manager are added. And databases. And we'll add everything in there. And that's enough for fooling around. By the way, this is kind of handy, this show description. I wish we had that everywhere. So we'll say OK. And we'll call next. And where do I want to save it? Same place. C drive. Code in chapter 8. So we'll go next and run as default. That's fine. And we'll call finish. Okay, now there's my SQL. And we'll start that. Set running. And if you notice, if I right click this and call start, it shows run 2. Now, I don't know how I killed it before, I guess when I was adding in the different performance counters. Let's just go ahead and generate some activity. We'll open a query off of chapter 7. I'll open the large execution plan and we'll execute it. Executed it several times just to get some activity. So we'll dump this out and now we're going to stop MySQL and she stopped. Now we'll come over and I'm going to go up to Performance Monitor. Okay, now I want to look at the activity that I collected with my user-defined sets. So I'm going to click this little icon here, second from the right. And I want to bring it in from log files, and let's remove that. And we'll call add. And if I look down in here, let's make sure we're in chapter 8. And I'll look in SQL 1, double click that. And what I'm going to bring in is we're going to look at data collector 01. And I'll call open and apply and OK. And now when I call add, you see now it's limited just to what I added into the data collection side. So I can expand this down and we'll add everything in here. And let's go to the other one too, SQL Server Databases, and we'll expand this down and we'll add all their information. And now we'll call OK. And as you see, we have quite a bit of information in here. Again, we just weren't doing anything. So we have all of the SQL counters that we included there. So we're showing them. We can change the colors, log hit ratio, and matter of fact, if you come through there and select it, you can see a spike in there, and then there's read ahead pages. Actually, that's a good thing. So you see the SQL Buffer Manager using read ahead, and here's our different information. If I had a lot of activity, of course, the graph would be much higher. Some other things we could do here, I can right click and you can save image as, and then you go through and save your image so you've got it for a later time. However, if you save your collections, that is your user-defined collection sets, then you can just do what I just did and add them into Performance Counter at any time. And there's Perf Counter. Extended events, though they've been around since SQL 2008, are something you really want to concentrate on. This is the emerging methodology for managing SQL. About extended events, as I said, they were first introduced in SQL Server 2008. However, they didn't have a GUI in place and they were reasonably complex to set up. So they really weren't used much. So with SQL Server 2012, a graphical interface for managing extended events was introduced, and that turned extended events into the preferred mechanism for gathering query performance metrics. SQL Profiler and traces were what we previously used, and as a matter of fact, we still use because you tend to use the tools that you're used to. However, Profiler and Trace are on the deprecation list, so you really want to move away from them. It's very common for SQL Server to give you a slow performance if there is a heavy database application workload, which means the nature of the queries themselves. So to analyze the cause of the bottleneck, it's important to examine the database application workload and identify the queries causing the most stress on system resources. To do that, you use extended events. Extended events are such a large subject that they could have their own course. So we're going to look at them right now in limited detail. Scenarios in which you should use extended events. When you're troubleshooting the cause of working set trimming, which means what is happening within the working set of a query. When you're troubleshooting excessive CPU usage, when you're looking into deadlocks, or when you're correlating request activity with Windows ETW logs. What is an action? In the context of an extended event, an action is a response to an event, and it provides the capability to execute additional code. You use predicates with extended events like you use predicates in a where clause. That is, you use them to limit the data, and here it is limiting the data that you capture. Extended event targets are event consumers. Targets can write to a file, store event data in the buffer, aggregate event data, etc., etc. Now, targets can process data synchronously or asynchronously. A SQL extended event session is created in the SQL process that is hosting the extended events engine. Extended event sessions have different states they can be in. Actions and predicates are bound to events on a per session basis. If you have event 1 in session A with action 1 and predicate Z, that will not in any way have an effect on event 1 in session B with action 2 and action 3 with no predicate. The Extended Events Wizard. You can graphically monitor your SQL Server queries, collect information in the background, analyze the performance of SQL Server, diagnose problems such as the aforementioned deadlocks, and debug a transact SQL statement. Max file size. That's set by default at 1 gigabyte, and that's pretty small considering the amount of information that can potentially be gathered with extended events. You might want to consider setting that number higher, maybe even much higher, maybe like 100 gigabytes. That will ensure you have adequate space to capture information, and you're not waiting for the file system to create files for you while the buffer fills. Microsoft debug events. You have access to these events if you create the session using T-SQL, but do not use them without guidance from Microsoft, as they are not designed for your use and they can change in a later release. Translation. Pretend they don't exist. System memory partitioning. For minor collection of events such as those we looked at, you don't need to really worry about partitioning your memory. But if you add many events and your session keeps growing, then you're going to want to increase the amount of memory that your system uses for these events. Avoid no event loss. That is a setting that you can set in extended events so that in no circumstance will an event be lost. Now, the design of extended events is such that you will likely lose some events, so you could set this so to prevent the loss of any events. But there's a big downside. If you do that, then you place a large overhead on the system, so it's probably not worthwhile. So as I say, avoid setting no event loss. At least I would suggest that as a best practice. In the next video, we're going to go in and look at using the Extended Events Wizard, so you'll see this actually working. Let's examine extended events. I'm over in SQL and I've expanded out the management folder and I expanded out extended events. And if you see down here, I have system health, which is one of those canned extended events that's by default turned on. So I'm going to right click it and I'm going to say watch live data. And now we'll wait until the live data comes up. By the way, if you're following along and you're doing this on a test SQL Server, etc., don't become discouraged when you do this, that it takes it a while. It's a low priority thread and it will take a bit of time for the live data to actually show up. It's returned some information, and as you see here, we can move between the different named events, and here's my timestamps. And the other information down here will change to give me details of what we're actually looking at. So there's my component IO subsystem, which is always interesting. And here's the different states within the information. And here's the monitoring system, call stack, kernel mode, etc. So you can see this is the system health that's always running. And we'll close that. And now, if I come over to extended events and right click on it, here if I do new session, that's without the wizard. And then I can go in and give it a name, manual, and select a template. And we're not going to do that. We're going to use the wizard. New session wizard and my splash page. Now, one of the best things you really want to do is not use the wizard. All database applications have different characteristics. And wizards, by their nature, are generalized. However, now that I've said that, you want perhaps to use the wizard to get started to understand how this stuff works. There is an unbelievable amount of information that you can look at. So it's going to take a long time to get familiar with extended events. As I said in the prior video, extended events could be a course in and of themselves, particularly if you combined it with data management objects. So session name, we'll call it my session, clever, and we'll go next. And choose, okay, use this event session template, and now I can pull this down, and here's the different templates I have. This is what Microsoft believes is of value. It's always smart to look and see what the software vendor has decided is a good idea. So connection tracking, database log, IO, I'm just going to pick that, and we'll go next. Now we get this little pop-up, and we have the selected events. This is why this is a template, because it's already come in and selected events. Now this is a nice little feature up here in the event library. If I want to add something else and I start typing, it'll just automatically go in and pick that up for me. That's a very handy little feature, but we're going to stick with the default and just go next. And down here, if we want to add or remove something, we can do it right in here. So if I want to put in like the client connection ID, that's fine. And we'll go next. And so now here's where I could add my predicate. So down here, I could add the clause and my field, select my operator, whatever it is, say database name, and I can set my operator right here as equal to or not equal to, and I have all my logic in here. And I can put some value in there, such as SQL Server database, and I'm looking at AdventureWorks 2014 or whatever. I would put that value in there. Now, we don't want to do that. So I'm going to go previous, and then I'm going to go next and see it, and she erased it. Sometimes that won't erase things, by the way. So now we'll go next. Now I can save it into a file, and here's that 1 gigabyte limit that we talked about. Okay, you notice it'll roll over after that 1 gig, so it depends. You know, that's a pretty low limit. And then here, where you would store it, you just browse into wherever you want to save it. And we're not going to save it. This is just a little demo. Instead, we're going to dump it into the ring buffer. And we'll go next. And here, we can see everything we did. This is the standard stuff. And you can expand that out and review what it is you just went through. There we go. This is always a feature now in SQL, this script business. And if I click that, it'll script it to the new query window, which is fairly interesting. Look at all that code they wrote for you. So we'll dump that and go back over, and we'll call finish. And I could start immediately, which we won't do. I'm just going to come out here. You see, I'm not doing it because I want to show you how to start it over here. I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to call start session. Okay, now the session's running. We can right click it and watch it. Again, we're watching live data, so I have to wait until the information actually is retrieved out of SQL. So we'll wait a few seconds here. And just like in the watch live data that we had before, we now have the different events that we came through and chose to look at. Exploring SQL Server security and roles. First off, there's 3 concepts you need to understand. And first is a principle. Now, a principal is an entity that's going to request permission to do something in SQL, to perform some type of an action. We normally think of principals as users, which is accurate. However, a principal can also be another server when one server needs to connect to another server to perform some action. In that case, the server that's doing the connection is a principal. A securable, that's what the principals want to get to. So the principals attempt to connect to some software object that is secured, and that software object is called a securable, such as a database. So Bob logs in, he's now the principal, and he wants to go over and run a query against the database. So Bob requests permissions to the securable. Now, most of the time, that's completely hidden from the user. They just log on to their domain and go rolling along. And we like it being completely hidden to the user. Permission. So different principals have different levels of permissions. That just makes sense. Now, Bob, who we've been persecuting for nigh on to 20 years into this business, we would never give much permission to. The philosophy is we want the lowest level of permissions we can grant to any principal to allow them to do their job. Levels. There's the Windows level. Now, there's 3 levels that I'm going to talk about, and what you want to think of is that these 3 levels are containment levels. So Windows, if you will, is a circle, and at the domain level, this is the outer circle. So Windows, we can log on to the Windows domain, and that log on is granted certain privileges, certain permissions to do different things, not only in SQL, but perhaps within Exchange, send mail and SharePoint, etc., etc. As a local logon, now we have a Windows server that does not run in the domain. So they run in a work group usually, and those are in very small companies. I suspect they're probably not running SQL. They're running maybe SQL Express. SQL Server levels. So after we're in the domain level or the local level, we can then log into SQL. And SQL is another security check. So SQL will allow, and we'll talk about authentication moments here in a second, SQL will allow, depending on how it's been set up, either a logon from Windows or a logon from SQL itself. So there we have a SQL Server login, and that login can be in various roles in the server. Database levels. We're in the final little contained level. Because if you think about the SQL Server we've been looking at all through this course, I had a number of databases on there. So though we get into SQL, our login may be only granted permissions in a certain database. That's very, very common. So now we move through Windows, we're into SQL, and we're into our database. Database levels have database users, a database role. A database role means that a certain user is in a role on that database and can do certain things, such as they can do backups. There's also a very special role called application role. You may never encounter it. Application role is designed for very special applications that normally have high turnovers, so that we don't have to constantly recreate different logins. And when a person logs in, then they're in the application role and they're doing inserts and deletes, etc. By the way, if a user has a very high set of permissions by their standard login and they switch to the application role login, they lose all of their permissions. In this role, permissions do not add. So they're in the application role. They can just do what we defined in that application role. Then when they exit, they pick up the permissions that they normally have, and the application role permissions are gone. Authentication levels. There's Windows. Windows is the default And it means just that. Windows is going to be in charge of the login, whether it's local Windows server or whether it's a domain. And as I say, most people using SQL today, at least at the level I work, are using domains. Mixed. Now I, being a dinosaur, happen to always install SQL in mixed mode because over the years, I've been able to use my SQL login to go in via SQL instead of via Windows in case something happened and for some reason the Windows account got corrupted. But anyway, it's just a process that I have maintained, and that doesn't mean that you should. So those authentication levels say either Windows or Windows and SQL. Notice there is no authentication level for SQL alone. Roles. There is fixed server and database roles. By the way, roles is an old term. In Windows, this is very similar to the concept of groups. So it just makes our life as administrators much easier. So we create a single group. SQL comes with fixed roles for the server and the database, and these roles have certain permissions applied to them. And what we try to do is make life easy. So we go over to Active Directory and we put users into these roles. Because they're in that role, then they pick up all of this set permissions. User-defined roles. So if the existing role does not meet your needs, then you can go in and create your own. The same thing as user-defined server roles. That was added with SQL 2012. And now you can take and create a user-defined server role, just like we could create a user-defined role for a database. Word to the wise. Don't do this unless you must. Document what you're doing for the poor person that has to follow you and try to figure out why you did this. We have to do it sometimes, but just be very, very careful. Anytime in SQL or in Windows, we create roles or groupings that are different than the default. Well, documentation, so you can explain it when they do what I call the search for the guilty. Application roles, I already talked about that. That's those very special little roles that were designed for very special applications. Let's take a look at the SQL server roles and the database level security. So as you see, I've got Object Explorer opened on the left, and dropping down, we have a folder here for security. And if I expand out the logins is a list of the principals that have permission to log into the system. And this is me down here, SQL Train, that's the name of the domain and the administrator. If we wanted to bring another person in, normally we bring in groups. So let's just explore that. I'm going to click Login, new login down here, login name, and I'll click Search, and I'll click Advanced, and I'll say Find Now. So as you see, as I come up and down, I'm looking in the Active Directory. I built a domain for this little demonstration here. And whenever you're looking into Active Directory and you see two people squished together, that icon right there, that means that's a group. So you would just select some groups and then pick them from a login. Now, if I go locations up here and I come in entire directory, and there you see my SQL Train, and I named it SQLtrain.democorp.biz, and I'll say OK, and I'll say Find Now. Now, if you noticed, it brought in more information. Here's account operators. There's an individual. There's administrator, which is me, and that's in the users folder up in Active Directory. And as we come up and down, you can see all the other different entities that are there. There's a domain controller, etc. So you bring in a login, either a group or an individual, that you want to grant permissions to. So now we have that login. Let's cancel out of that. So they're logged into what? Well, over on the database, if we expand out database and we come into security, now you see the concept of users. So if we want to add a user, say to AdventureWorks, I'm just going to right click, new user, username, and login name. I'm going to hit the ellipses, ... and I'll say browse. And what I'm browsing here is not Active Directory, but the logins that we had down there in SQL. And if you notice that one right there, it just says SA. That account there is, because I installed in mixed mode, that is my SQL login. So SQL will authenticate that. That is not a Windows account, and I'll cancel out of it. So that's how I would take a login, add a login, and then bring them in as a user. Now let's close this. And as we're in the database, let's keep thinking about database. And within a database, there's certain roles. So I can take a user and put them into a role. And if I take, for example, DBO, database owner, and double click it, role members is the DBO, which happens to be me. You know, I'm the owner, I'm the DBO, SQL admin. When I installed, I put myself in the DBO role. If you watched that video, you saw me click add current user. All right, so anyway, if I wanted to add another user into this role, I would click add and then browse in, cancel, cancel, cancel. DBO has all permissions down here. And then I could add in, see the DBO and the guest, and these are other logins. For another example, if you really have a large database, then you might have people in the security admin role, right? So then see the owner's DBO again, and you could add someone here so that they would really be in charge of security. And there's your different roles on your database. If that's not enough, database role, I can go through this. I can give it a name up here. And then the securables, yeah, okay, it's going to make me give it a name. Here in the securables, I could search and I can specific objects, and I would pick what I wanted to secure and go on from there. As I gave you the disclaimer, I think in the previous video, you really want to think that one through. You just really complicated your management job. That said, sometimes you just have to do it. Okay, so moving back down here now into the server, here's your server roles. So you see database creator, which makes sense. That's a server-wide permission. Disk admin, sysadmin, server admin, etc. So you have these different roles. And again, you can right-click here, new server roles, and owner. You notice it stamps it up here for me. So we can secure the logins. We can secure a endpoint down here. So TCP endpoint, this is really getting granular. And then you add the members, and down here would show you the memberships. Again, this is something you want to really think through if you're actually going to do that. Now, Microsoft has a lot of help for you in security. First off, I've got this security poster, and you can download this security poster. This is designed to print out as a poster. This is a pretty handy little thing. I used to have these posters all over my office because they were really handy when you're having different discussions. Now we also have database level roles, and this will walk you through and give you the different permissions or what that level role can do for you, such as backup operator, fixed data can back up the databases. And then it comes through and shows you MSDB roles, special purpose roles. Another one, this is security considerations. This is absolutely something you should read through. And this is not a small document. This has a lot of little using firewalls, isolated, configuring your file system secure, NetBIOS, etc. Surely something you should look through. Finally, server level roles. So SQL Server 2014. And this will show you the different server roles and what that server role can do. Almost always, Microsoft has man-hours into this. And with that kind of experience, they pretty much figured this out. But not always. You may have to create a special server role or a special database role. But please start with this and go down and see what these people can do. And that's where you're at. So there's the different help. And there it is over in SQL Server Management Studio. Let's walk through the process of adding users into a database to get them permissions. Now, before I started, I created the database you see highlighted, research, and I did that in the usual way. It's just kind of an empty database. It's just right-click, new database. So now I've got research up here, and I also went over to Active Directory, and I created a group named research, and I added a user into it, Norsavib, which is Ron Davis spelled backwards. I'm Ron Davis. We've created a research database. We're going to let them go crazy. They're going to own the database. And we want to be able to get them in. And when I say them, what I mean is the research team comes and goes. So what we want to do is we're going to allow our Windows administrators or Active Directory administrators, when they add a user into the system, they're just going to grab the user and dump them into the research group over in Active Directory. And that permission then will cascade on through, and they're into SQL, into the login, and into the database that we want them in. Follow? So let's go to login. First off, let's expand login. Under security, login, right click, new login. And I want to do a search up in here. So I'm going to click search. And now what I want to do, I'm going to go into object types. And what I want to search for is groups. And I really don't care about users or built-in securities or weird stuff, any of that, just groups. Okay, if I go advanced, down here now I can come in and I can find now, and I'll click find now, and it brings in all of the different users. Now up here, if I come in the locations, I actually want to go that way. And now that'll make this live, and if I type in RE, which is the first two letters of research, and I say find now, ta-da, there it is. Now, why does that matter? You can have thousands of groups. So research is what we want, and we're going to say, okay, there's research, and we'll say, okay, and I can change this right here, but I'm going to leave master set up right now so I can show you that. And we'll say, okay. So now, from the SQL_train domain, the one that I created, I have research down here as a login. Okay, step one is good. Now we come up to the research database, and within research database, I'm going to go into security, and over here in users, I'm going to take user, and I'm going to right click, and we're going to go new user. And down here, login name, I'm going to just click on this, browse, and there's my group. And I'll say okay, and I'll say okay, SQL research, and we'll say okay. Normally we don't do this, but you can use a special name. Like if you're bringing in Bob, well, nobody wants to be Bob, so we can change his name to Jim or something like that. So research, and we say okay. And now I've got the research down here, which remember is logged into that group. So let's double click research down here, and we can go in here to general, Windows user, owns schema, membership, and it will show you all the roles, members, the securables, etc. And I'll say okay. And now the final step. Let's expand out database roles. And there's DBO, and everybody in research is going to own this database. And we'll say add, browse, there's research, and we'll say okay, okay, okay. And now research down here has been added into the DBO owners group of the research database. Let's take a look at auditing data access. The truth of it is I can audit just about everything that we're going to do within SQL. So the first thing we need to set up under the security folder, under server, is audits, right-click audit, new audit, and we need to set this up so there is a location for the logs to be saved into. Your audit name is automatically filled out, and if you like, what you should do, you should give it some significant name so you can figure it out. But I'm just going to call it my audit log. And we're going to save it into the file. As you see, you can save it into the application log, security log, whatever it is you want to do. And on a path, I'm going to select the path under the C drive, under code, And all you have to do is select one under Chapter 9, which we're in right now. And I created a folder, Save Audit Logs. And we'll say OK. And we're good to go. So we'll just say OK. And now we have my audit log. And I'm going to go ahead and right-click it and enable it. Okay, now she's running. So far, we've got nothing. So now if I go up to the database and select Security, right-click, New, Database Audit Specification. Now, again, you can fill it out, and I'm going to say DBO _ select. Whatever it is I'm trying to figure out. And now it's asking, when it says audit, it wants to know, okay, so where do I save this stuff? And I'm going to say my audit log, what I just created. Now, action. If I pull that down, we're going to create the easiest thing I can, a select statement. And object class would be database, because I want to look against the database. Object name is Browse AdventureWorks 2014. Okay. Principal name. So we're auditing access for who? So I'll just select principal name and browse again, and we're going to select a role. Remember, roles are very similar, very similar to groups. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to select the DBO owner role. If I was auditing access into like that research database that we created earlier, and we had all kinds of researchers in there, then I can audit the access of that group and see what it is they're doing. And we'll say OK. And we'll say OK here. And now it's live. And we'll say OK here. But when I said it's live, it's not turned on. If you can see that, the little red down arrow. But I'll right-click here and I'll say Enable. Close. Now I've got a very basic select statement. And we'll open that up under Code, Chapter 9, select for audit, and we'll execute it, F5. Okay, and let's see what happened. So we'll go over here to my audit log, and I'll right-click in here, View Audit Log, and there's my audit log. Let's go full screen. So there's my SQL, and if I come across, there's my session principal name, administrator. Remember, I am the DBO. And there's my SID, security identifier. As we come across, and I'm accessing the schema. And this has the different information that I want to look at. File name, file offset, etc. And there's my access log information. So normally I would go in and I could come in and set up a rather much more granular in here and look for inserts or for failures, etc. But you can audit just about everything that you want to do within a SQL with these audit logs. The next steps, or where do I go from here? A lot of that depends on what you envision your future being with SQL. Now, if you want to be a database administrator, then you must have a really good knowledge of Transact SQL. And if you don't have that, the lynda.com online library has a lot on Transact SQL, and there are literally thousands of resources you can find. You can also just search for example questions and go from easy to the medium to the hard, and they'll ask you, okay, in this scenario, how would you code it out? You got to be able to answer that if you're going to get a job. The second thing is, if you're an experienced administrator and you're just looking to move forward from one of the previous iterations of SQL, then I strongly suggest two things. One, really learn extended events and its, I call it sibling, DMOs, or data management object and data management views. They are the future of working with SQL. And of course, SQL PowerShell is really an up and coming thing too. But I'm more of a fan of the data management views and extended events. The third, if you're a developer and you want to work within SQL, that is, you're writing applications that are going to be pounding the database, then explore how your application interacts with the database so that it interacts efficiently. Particularly if you're passing through code. Don't do that, by the way. get somebody to write a stored procedure for you over on the server, or write it for them and let them deploy it and call that stored procedure. So you have to figure out those things. Now, in the land of SQL, the land of SQL is a wonderful land to live in if you want to make a really good living and have a lot of access. And by the way, when I say the land of SQL, a lot of what you learn about SQL translates over into all of the other guys too, into DB2 and into Oracle, into MySQL. So, you're not going to be left here. This stuff is all based on math, so it all has a common thread. I wish you well, and thanks a lot for watching this course.